right, so we're here with Ken McCarthy, who is an author and influencer in the medical freedom movement and elsewhere, and he just came out with a new book called Diabolical Errors about the strange and unsettling history of vaccine science. And it's only available in excerpt form right now, but soon to be in full-length form. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. You're the first person to interview me, so you're going to get the best interview.
Nice, nice. Looking forward to it. I noticed right away in this book that you note that nobody seems to be able to come up with a coherent definition for the term vaccinology, which this is a sort of history of what kind of definitions did they give you that were so
Well,
baffling?
in the subtitle, I use the term vaccine science, which is just another way of saying vaccinology, or vaccinology, or however you say it. And so whenever I'd ask a regular person, what is vaccinology? They'd go, I don't know. And I mean, yeah, but then when I say, what's vaccine science? They go, well, I guess it must be the science of vaccines. It's just an example of how they put little spins on words that make it like impenetrable for the average person. When
Yeah.
when you actually break it down, what they're saying, they're just saying something very simple.
Well, yeah, that's the Orwellian thing. You control the language, you control the thoughts. So that's how it
And boy, does
goes.
medicine have that down to a science.
Yeah, what were some of the most astonishing things you found out in this? It's basically a history of like the preliminary foundation upon which the vaccine quote unquote science is based, right? Like
Yeah,
talk about what inspired you to dig a little deeper here.
well, I was writing a book called The Reality of Vaccine Injury and Extreme Autism. And because there is such a thing as vaccine injury and there is such a thing as extreme autism, but the medical profession would like you to think that neither of those two things exist. And they certainly don't want you to think they're connected. So I'm working on this book and I thought, well, I've got to give a little history of the history of vaccinations. Like where did it all come from? There must have been, at some point, there must have been some intelligent experiment that was done that showed that all this makes sense. And so I started looking and looking, and I went deeper and deep. I still haven't found it. I've written 50 plus chapters, and I'm still looking for a definitive experiment that actually establishes that the whole principle of vaccination makes any sense whatsoever.
Yeah, there's another famous book on the vaccine skepticism called Turtles All the Way Down. I think
Oh
that that's a
yeah,
great way of describing it. That the deeper you go, you just find that it's based on smoke and mirrors largely. Um, well, we know that history is written by the victors, as you've sort of gone over in some of your other books. When did you first realize that medical history was also suffering from this same lack of, let's say, perspective?
well, what's really weird is if you read the mainstream accepted medical history, if you go be, there's the cartoon version, which is, that first there was smallpox, and then, Washington inoculated his troops and saved the day, and then there was Pasteur, and that's what we're told in school. But when you actually read the mainstream medical historians, not fringe people, or they just tell you what actually happened. And what actually happened is crazy. Like there's no science anywhere. In fact, one of the sections of the book, the ultimate book that will come out, is called Witchcraft and Wishful Thinking. And when you look at what they considered experiments and science as they were proving that vaccines worked, it was witchcraft with a lot of wishful thinking and also a lot of PR. In every single instance I found, there was not just good PR, but black belt, heavyweight, world class PR. One of the examples would be Pasteur. I'll give you just this one example. So we all know Louis Pasteur, great man, blah, 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 blah. And he actually was a great industrial chemist. And he did a lot of really good things if you're in the food preparation business, like if you're brewing beer or making cheese. Yeah, Louis Pasteur did it. But the other stuff he did was crazy. And he's, by the way, considered the father of modern immunology. And he did the first injected vaccine in history. And maybe we'll talk about that crazy story. But the reason we know about Louis Pasteur and his witchcraft and wishful thinking is his son-in-law was one of the most politically and journalistically connected person of his generation in France. Like all his relatives were novelists and major journalists. His first job out of college was assistant to the guy that eventually became the president of France. Like this guy was plugged in. And everywhere you go, everywhere you look at the history of vaccination, there's always some really high-powered PR guy blowing the horn.
Do you think that in a way, the way that the vaccine apologists or vaccine proponents approach the medical freedom community as being unscientific and quackery and whatnot, do you think that there's an element of like crying out in pain as they strike you, given that there's, as you found in this book, such an unscientific basis for vaccinology? I mean, I would think that it would be a good idea to go into some of Pasteur's early experiments. The thing with the rabies is just next level insane, and the fact that they know deep down inside, or do they know? Do you think that there's some degree of overcompensating for their own lack of scientific rigor, or do you think that they're just, going
Well,
after the first thing?
it kind of reminds me of your favorite country and mine, Israel. They're always the victim of everything.
Oh yeah.
Everyone's always picking on them, and nobody, they're the most democratic nation on earth. They're the most ethical army that ever existed,
Yes.
this stuff. And the medical profession is actually kind of pulling that same game. And yeah, I think when they learn this stuff in medical school, they just gloss over the actual origins and roots of everything, and they just get straight to the procedures. And they tell you, oh yeah, there's a lot of science somewhere. Don't worry about it. It's there. I call it in the back of the book, I call it the Great Pyramid. What do I say? Great Pyramid size pile of papers, studies, and journal articles. I mean, it's a huge pile. And when you see a huge pile, you think, well, it must be
There must be
right.
something there. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of like a legal trick. Like, if you're fighting somebody and they want discovery, you go, sure. And you send them a container load of papers and say, have at it. You figure it out. Or when Kennedy was killed, John F. Kennedy, who was the CIA dude who was on the Warren Commission, the brother
Dulles.
Dulles, he said, I mean, he even said this. He said, it's 28 volumes or whatever it is. Let them read it and see if they can figure it out.
Yikes.
Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
kind of medical science, at least on the vaccine side. Maybe other parts. I mean, I think surgeons are pretty good. They actually can do some pretty good stuff.
Well, I mean,
But
the history
this,
of surgery, as you go into in this
well,
book, is also quite not exactly as we've been led to believe, let's say.
well, at least the surgeons got somewhere. Like they
That's
got
true.
somewhere useful. Yeah, I mean, the history of surgery. Yeah, I mean, I would pull a thread and I'd go, oh, that's kind of interesting. I wonder how that happened, and then I'd pull more on the thread and I'm going, what? How did that happen? Then I pull on that thread and then I go all the way back to the beginning and I'm like, there's no there there. This came out of thin air, completely arbitrary, completely accidental, and it's been piled up as if it were some pile of evidence, and it is no such thing.
And now, do you think that it was sheer force of money and influence, political influence, that got it to supersede what the currently accepted practice of medicine was, which was this stuff like eclectic medicine, which I'd like to talk a little bit about more later. I'd never even heard of that, and I consider
Oh yeah.
myself pretty well versed in this stuff. But the fact that Rockefeller and the Flexner report were just able to steamroll over like homeopathy and naturopathy and all these formerly accepted forms of medicine, was it just sheer force of money and power, or was there some other tricks that they were pulling, or was it just that everybody thought that this new stuff was really awesome and we needed to give it a chance?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting thing because if we talk about the Rockefeller angle on this, which is true, everybody's probably heard hints that Rockefeller had a big influence on medicine, and all I can say is whatever you've heard has been wildly underestimated. I mean, they absolutely steamrolled over the entire medical profession. They erased the last 5 or 6 thousand years of it and replaced it with what they thought was better. A purely industrial model that treats human beings like machines. If one breaks, it's no big loss. Just replace a piece, and if that doesn't work, well, get another one. Don't forget one of the things that Rockefeller did was help murder a bunch of striking coal strike
Coal
uh,
miners.
coal miners, kill a whole bunch of coal miners in the state you're in now. I believe it was.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I know that there were a whole bunch of cold wars going on back in the day. I didn't realize that Rockefeller was personally involved in it, though.
Oh yes. Actually, he had sort of semi-retired, and it was Rockefeller Jr. But yeah, these guys, they were like we ain't doing this anymore. Like we don't want to work. I think they were asking for a 6 day week. I think
How dare they? You just
10
froze.
thing from you. We'd like to be able to buy from other sources. And the Rockefellers who owns that particular company, oh, good. Are we having trouble with our internet connection?
You froze for like half a second. You're good now.
Okay. Okay, good, good. We'll just soldier on. And and they set up tent camps all over the place. And Rockefeller Jr. said, I'm not with this. And he had his security men and the local National Guard surround these people with machine guns and fire into the tent encampment and set fires to the tent. And women and children were killed. I mean, it was like a regular Gaza event,
Yikes.
just on written small. And people didn't like it.
I can imagine why.
At which point they hired, talking about PR, at which point they hired the famous Ivy Lee, who was one of the great PR people, kind of on the level of Edward Bernays. He also went on to give advice to Benito Mussolini, the Nazi Party, IG Farben, but he started out by advising the Rockefellers how to get out of the mess they were in when they massacred innocent people who just wanted to make a living. But when you ask how all this came, it boils down to somebody at each of the critical junctures, somebody with a ton of money and ton of power, not just money, but power, who knew nothing about medicine, never studied it, never practiced, never put a band-aid on anybody, never took a science class, got under the thrall of somebody who he thought knew what medicine was and decided, oh, I'll go with this guy and we'll just roll out whatever he says. That's the history of modern medicine, and it's crazy.
It's definitely crazy. I was reading the chapter on childbirth and
Oh
how
my God.
the just because of one case where the midwife to the queen, who was like very good at her job and who had saved the lives of hundreds of women and their babies, and then all of a sudden one woman who she's delivered the baby successfully, and then the woman gets a fever, and then doctors kill her with their treatments, but she's blamed for it, and then after that it's just no more midwives in the French monarchy anymore. That's
Yeah.
insane.
And
But
not
that's yeah.
and not only no more midwives for the French monarchy, the whole, it's a 200 million year practice of
Yikes.
childbirth, right? All mammals do
Yeah.
it. And obviously they've done it successfully because we've got cows and sheep and we got chicken, not
Yeah,
chickens,
they
but
don't have to lie down on the operating table and spread their legs. They just plop
yeah.
them out. I mean, that the fact that gravity has not been, I mean, maybe it's just because I've never had children, but it seems like I never even thought of that, the gravity factor. But duh, yeah, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah, gravity's, so some people, not a lot, people, not everyone's given birth. I certainly haven't, never will. But basically, gravity really helps. And
Yeah,
so
you
what,
would think.
so what the, and all mammals do it. All mammals take advantage of gravity, except for human beings starting in the 1600s in France.
Just
And
the hubris of these
unfortunately,
people to think that they can overpower nature. I mean, it's nuts.
yeah, it was really a bad idea. Yeah, so if you look at the history of childbirth, women were either sitting in what is called a birthing chair, or they were squatting, or they were walking around, or they were being, they were standing, standing up, and people were helping them, and they would move positions all the time because this being is coming out of you. And sometimes you need to be in a different position. Sometimes all fours helps, and so one of the keys is freedom of movement. So what did the French barbers do? Because it was French barbers that invented modern childbirth. Read the book, you'll see.
Has to be seen to be
They
believed.
said they said, well, we think it's better if women lie flat on their back and don't move. And to help them not move, we'll have assistants hold their legs open, and then we'll pull the baby out instead of let the woman move and sort of get in whatever position she needs to be, whatever position feels right, so that gravity works and the baby finds its way out as it has done for 200 million years. I'm not talking about human beings being around for
Yeah,
200 million years, but mammals.
mammals.
It's a good system. It's unlikely we're going to improve on it. We can respect it. We can not interfere with it as step one, right? But modern childbirth does everything possible to interfere with a 200 million year old process that has proven itself to be wildly successful. And so what happened was, if you want, should I go off on this tangent
Yeah,
or we can
yeah, go ahead.
so the women used to help women give birth, right? And then, unfortunately, there was a catastrophe in France, this 36-year war between the Catholics and the Protestants, and it was horrible. Villages burned to the ground, fields, not planted, just a disaster. And so everybody flooded into Paris, and Paris wasn't ready. And we take things like flush toilets for granted, and I don't want to get gross, but imagine there were no flush toilets and there were no porta potties. Like it's going to be a mess really fast. And housing was so bad that it wasn't, you used to hear like a whole big family of 8 people would live in one tenement apartment. In Paris, it was multiple families living in one room. And they had sewers were open trenches in the middle of the street. So you just take your pot out and put it in the middle of the street, or you'd throw it out the window and hope you
Hope
hit the
nobody was
middle.
wandering around.
Yeah. I mean, this is how people lived. So believe it or not, they got sick. So there was this thing called the Hotel Dieu, the Hostel of God, which was originally set up as a place where pilgrims could come and stay while they were visiting all the shrines in Paris, and it turned into basically a public hospital. And as Paris got bigger and bigger, and people got sicker and sicker, and the society broke down and further, this thing was just flooded. I think they ended up with like 10 times the number of people they expected to have, all sick. Beds are not what we think of today, nice, comfortable beds. Maybe you share a bed with a good friend, or you have a bed to yourself. No, in this particular place, there might be 4, 5, 6, 7 people in on one bed.
So basically, it
And it
was a
might
captive audience on which they could practice their medical
Well, that
techniques.
there you go. There you go. And so you could have one guy could have typhus, another guy could be, just nuts, and then you'd have a woman giving birth all on the same bed. So and so the guys that took over were what they call barber surgeons, because when they were originally teaching, this is wild. When they were originally teaching medicine, all the universities were Catholic, and this is way back like 1200. Those universities were set up to train people to operate in the Catholic bureaucracy. That was their sole purpose. So there were courses in law, there was courses in theology, and then Paris had an innovation. Let's do a course in medicine. But the weird thing was, if you were a student at the University of Paris, you were automatically considered a cleric. Okay, you didn't have to be a priest, but you were within the clerical bureaucracy. And the law said clerics may not draw blood. So you couldn't fight, which was great. They didn't have to go to war. They didn't have to get into duels. They couldn't be executioners. They couldn't be torturers, but they also couldn't do any surgery of any kind. So they would just propound on what needed to happen. Hey, you should do this, you should do that. So the guys that picked up the slack were literally barbers. And they said, "Oh, you need to have this thing carved off of you. You need a limb amputated. I've got something sharp." And so the
Kind
so
of
the
amazing.
this is how it was, right?
Yeah.
So the physicians would tell the barber, well, you see the barber pole like out,
Mhm.
with the red thing around it. Well, that's like a sign of surgical procedures. That's what that was for.
So if
That
you
would
had your gallbladder was ailing you, you would just
well,
stumble into one of these places and say, "Please help me."
which is really interesting. Apparently, because of the anatomy, it's men's bladder stones are very difficult to get out. It's a little easier with women, but with men, it's a whole surgical process, right? So that's one of the processes they would do. Amputations. I just all kinds of crazy stuff, right? And those guys ended up being very powerful and important in the Hotel Dieu, the Hotel of God, the hotel, whatever. It was never a hotel. It was a place where people hung out, and it morphed into like a hospital. It's still there, by the way. It's right across the street from the Notre Dame Cathedral.
Probably
Um,
smells a lot better though.
I hope so. I mean, could you imagine? I mean, oh my
That's the
God.
thing with history. You know, the history books don't have like a scratch and sniff function.
No,
You
and,
can't
and
really
thank
tell
God
what
they
it
don't.
smelled like. Yeah. I mean, and
And,
that actually gets into some of the history of vaccines. I mean, the vaccine industry takes credit for the improvements in survival of babies and children in the 20th century, but really it was sanitation that was largely to credit for that, right? I
Well,
mean,
I mean, think about it. If you can use your imagination, and it's hard because it's gross, and just imagine a life without flush toilets and people living 7, 8, 10 to a room. And your water, maybe you go down to the river and bring back a bucket.
yeah, if somebody hasn't just thrown a dead body in it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you got cows in the backyard and chicken. I mean, it was see, people could do that in the countryside because there's some, some elbow room and the cows manure kind of turns into soil and it all works out in the end. But when you start packing human beings together like that, they're going to get sick. And so yeah, once you can see the rate of infectious diseases in New York City. I think I have it in one of my books. As soon as indoor plumbing, because indoor plumbing was not ubiquitous in Manhattan until the 20s,
Yikes.
which is really frightening.
Yeah.
But you can see as soon as indoor plumbing became ubiquitous, the infectious rate just crashes. It just goes away. Nothing to do with vaccines, nothing to do with medicine.
Why didn't the
Just,
sanitation industry try to take credit for that? You would think that they would have their own PR people.
well, blue collar guys, they just sort of like they go and they do it and it's their job and they're
I
not
mean,
desk guys, they're not word guys,
that's
they're get it done guys.
that's true. I mean,
But
I think it's interesting how history repeats itself. You describe the invasion of privacy and police state tactics the British used on their Indian colonial subjects under the guise of fighting the plague. I'll have a quote here: forced entry into people's homes at all hours of day and night, physical examinations of women by male inspectors, forced removal of the sick, many of whom were never seen again, the destruction of homes and property, and forced injections with an experimental plague vaccine. I mean, that could have come straight out of COVID,
yeah,
basically. And I mean, to what extent is just like, okay, dead men tell no tales. If the plague the vaccine victims die, we don't hear from them, so we assume everything went great. I mean, it boggles the mind that humanity has fallen for this again and again. Why do you think that is?
well, I think there's such a huge gap. And let me just say this before I answer that question. I mean, imagine that these were the poorest of the poor living underneath a brutal military occupation, and that's how they were being treated. Well, fast forward to 2020, we're all being treated that way,
Yep.
right? And so how does this happen? I think the way it happens is there is no education about real education about health, biology, how the body works, what health is, what causes illness, what's reasonable to expect from medicine, what's not reasonable. We don't get any of that education in school. So we have this class of people and we sort of leave it all up to them. And they are as the I think I have a chapter on this guy Welsh, who's kind of like the root of all evil. He was the founder of Johns Hopkins Medical School. They basically completely co-opted medical practice, and turned it upside down, literally. Maybe we could get into that a little bit too. And so we're leaving everything related to health up to these people because somehow they know better. And when you look at the history of medicine, there's never been a time in history when they knew better. They just knew something and they were doing it. And sometimes it was okay. And sometimes it was disastrous. For instance, going back to the childbirth thing, taking women blocking women from being able to move into whatever position they felt comfortable in and whatever position they thought would help the baby move and literally locking them down on their backs and negating gravity. How many millions of people did that kill? I mean, we can't even calculate it because it started in France, in this place that I talked about, and these barber surgeons came in and they thought, well, I don't know, I've never done this before. I think it would be kind of comfortable for me if you laid
Yeah,
down,
exactly.
and I'll just yank the baby out, and if it goes badly, well, it's God's will. And we still have a lot of that God's will thing going on, except now it's Pharma's will or Fauci's will or
Yeah,
CHD's
the
will.
speed at which science as God replaced religion and the seamless way that fused to each other. I mean, Thomas Saz, the psychiatric critic, has a book about the origins of mental illness called The Manufacture of Madness, in which he traces the origin of mental illness to the Salem witch, well, not Salem witch trials, but the witch trials in general, the witch burnings, witch hunting, and how that was just sort of seamlessly fused into the psychiatric industry. You mentioned you call one of your chapters witchcraft and wishful thinking. Was there any sort of origins in the witch
Oh
hunts?
yeah, yeah. So let's go to the original. They always go back to smallpox and the original smallpox inoculations and how that was proof of concept. And the way that happened was there was this English lady who was, I guess, stationed with her husband in Constantinople, now Istanbul, and she saw a lady, another woman, like a folk person, rubbing. I mean, this is. I mean, it sounds so gross and it sounds like an exaggeration, but it's literally What it was, you cut a little incision, you take pus from an infected person with smallpox, and you rub it onto the open cut. And somehow that little dose of smallpox is thought to teach your body how to fight smallpox. And I don't know, maybe it were, I don't know, but it sounds pretty gross to me. So she thought it was great. And she brought it back to England. And one of her friends was Princess, oh, I can't remember the name, it's in the book somewhere, who ended up becoming queen. Anyway, both these ladies just thought this was the greatest thing ever, and they did it to their kids. They also did it to prisoners, people in jail, to test it. And then, now talk about witchcraft. So in the 1600s, Cotton Mather, who was a preacher in early Boston, who was an expert on witchcraft, he was certain witchcraft existed, wrote a whole book about it. He became an enthusiast for this smallpox thing. Now, by the way, no doctor today would dream in their wildest
Hope not.
drunken fantasies of doing this to another human being. But that was the birth of vaccines. They literally celebrate that as like, the original insight from which we built.
Yikes. Yeah, so there is got to be some understanding of the lack of science underlying
I,
all of this.
and people were hip to it. Believe it or not, it was illegal. I forget which state, but one of the states, Virginia had made it a crime to do this medical procedure. It was literally a crime. But then some big-mouthed Revolutionary War medical officer he thought it was cool, so he was starting to agitate. And he was writing all these broadsides, pamphlets about the army needs to start doing this. And Washington was like, oh, "We're not going there, man. We're not doing this." But somehow they got to him, and he wrote some kind of like offhanded order. Yeah, let's do this. But they never did it. I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe a few people did it. And when you read the conditions under which that war was fought, I mean, it makes what we've described about Paris look like a weekend at the Riviera. I
Yikes.
mean, these guys had this is winter. They had no shoes. They had no coats. Whatever food they got, they had to scrounge. I mean, it was insane. So the idea that there was this, they said, oh yes, they set up the revisionist history says they set up special inoculation camps where those who were inoculated spent 6 weeks in bed, where they were fed a special diet this never happened, right? But what did happen was some guy decided that it was a good story. He he was this guy who wrote. You ever heard of the story of, oh, George Washington cut down the cherry tree?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And then George Washington threw a silver dollar across the Potomac and all that. All those insane stories. Why would anybody cut down a cherry tree, young or old? No one does that, right? It never happened. It never happened. But there was a guy who he had this wagon. He started as a preacher. And then he realized preaching wasn't working out. And then he got a wagon full of books, and he would take kind of a good idea. He took the wagon through the wilderness, and he'd arrive in town, and he'd sell Bibles mostly, but he'd sell books. Well, when Washington died, he started writing books about Washington. They were selling like crazy, and he didn't have enough stories, so he just made up a lot of stories.
Wow.
And one of the stories he made up was the smallpox story. There's more that the inoculation, and then that got elaborated on. So that went to sleep for about 200 years, and then in the 1920s, some dude that wanted to push vaccination for all children rewrote the Washington story and blew it up even bigger and said not only was Washington a fervent believer in inoculation, he had all the troops do it, and that's what made that's why we won the war. That's why we beat the British. It
Wow.
wasn't the heart and soul and guts of these guys fighting in the snow with no shoes. It was this crazy inoculation, which never happened. There's no records that it happened. I mean, there's like some reports, but the record keeping is terrible. It's spotty. It's like the idea that this was a all force inoculation was just BS. And yet that's one of and oh, they went back because there's Valley Forge. There's another place where they spent the winter in the around 2000, they went and created these whole what do you call it? Not panoramas, but panels, big panels telling the Washington smallpox story.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
These guys leave no stone unturned when they're trying to sell a line of bullshit. Like they think of every possible angle. And one of the angles is go to Valley Forge, go to Morristown. you
Well,
know?
one thing that speaking of angles was that one thing that I noticed in a lot of the 2020 hindsight reporting on COVID focuses on framing the response as a series of catastrophic quote unquote mistakes. And while the title of your book seems to go along with that, what to what extent do you think these were actually mistakes? I mean, the lack of scientific basis and everything, like just going along with this. Do you think these people were just blundering on for sheer goodwill, or like, I mean, did they know what they were doing?
This is a really interesting question, and I'm really thinking the formula is this: a guy with tons of money and tons of political power, which includes PR power and legislative power. So that you need that. That's step one. Step two, oh, and who knows nothing about science and nothing about medicine. I mean, nothing. Like J.D. Rockefeller didn't know. I doubt he could put a Band-Aid on somebody, right? He didn't finish high school. No offense, he did pretty well for himself, but he never finished high school. He certainly didn't study science. Okay, so you got that guy over here. Then you have some like wild-eyed guy that gets some crazy idea that he's sure is true because he looked at somebody else doing something crazy. I mean, literally, it's a chain of craziness starting with the smallpox inoculation and it just kept rolling along. So somehow, when those two, and the rich guy wants to make a big impact on the world. He
Right.
wants the world to operate more efficiently.
His legacy.
Like legacy, and also he's so sure that he knows everything because he happened to make money refining oil that he therefore knows everything about everything. Right. So when that guy comes together with the crazed medical guy, and if they find a meeting of the minds, we are all in very serious peril. And I didn't see any evidence of a desire to kill vast amounts of the population. I really think they thought they were doing something intelligent. And yet, none of the science. Let's talk about Pasteur, because that one
Yeah.
really, everybody's heard of Louis Pasteur. He's practically a saint. He can do no wrong, blah, blah, blah. Here's what he did. First, I want to go back to the good things he did. He did a lot of industrial chemistry stuff, like because people used to brew beer in small quantities, right? They used to, right? But when you're starting to try to brew beer, like in vast industrial sized quantities, which started basically when he was a young man coming up, it goes wrong, right? Because you need such a high level of sanitation when you're dealing on that scale. You can't like have little errors, if you're brewing your own beer in your backyard, you kind of can watch it and you know whether it's on or off, right? But when you've got vats and vats and vats, it's like you better have procedures in place or it's going to go wrong. He's the guy that figured all that stuff out. So if you like beer, wine, cheese, mass produced, thank Louis Pasteur. But then he had a stroke and he started losing it. And he still wanted to be famous and he had run out of tricks. And so 7 years, and so he got really interested in injecting things into animals, right? So he did very well with the cheese and the milk and the wine and all that, even silkworms. He figured out how to keep silkworms healthy and happy. But for some reason, and this was a craze, the craze of medicine in the 19th century was get a hypodermic needle, and they were pretty new then, put
Okay.
some crazy shit in it, inject it into an animal or a person, and watch what happens.
Wow.
They did a lot of this in the 19th century. So he was working with animals primarily, and then, as I mentioned, his daughter married this very plugged in dude, like Edward, sort of like the 19th century version of Edward Bernays, except with huge political connections and a deep family connection into journalism. It's hard to imagine. I can't think of anybody today who I could even compare in terms of reach and influence, like influencer beyond influencer. So that was his son-in-law. So he decided, hey, I've worked on these animals. Let me work on some people. So they claimed that there was this rabies outbreak, that rabies was a terrible thing and it was killing everybody and it was a scourge of humanity. Well, I think there were 24 rabies cases in all of Paris, a city of, I think, 2 million at the time. That's not a scourge. I mean, and by the way, they had no test for rabies. So
Yeah,
if a
that's the other
dog,
thing.
if a dog was like acting angry and frothing at the mouth, they just called it rabies,
Right.
right? Um, so so it's like, oh, maybe I'll cure rabies. So what he was doing, I may laugh because it's so, I mean, it's sick, but it's crazy and it's funny at the same time in a weird way. So what they were doing was they would take a dog that they believed had rabies, kill it, dry out its brain and its spinal cord, grind it up into powder, and then inject it into another dog and see what happens. Well, I mean, if you inject any tissue, any crap into an animal, you're likely to make it sick.
Yeah.
So these animals will get sick, and then they said, "Aha, we found what causes rabies. So we'll just put a smaller amount in using the principle of smallpox, which was worked out by this this royal lady who never took a science class, by Cotton Mather, who was an unhinged witchcraft,
Weirdo.
documenter. And we'll build on that beautiful foundation. This story is so bizarre. So a boy gets bitten by a dog, something like 200 miles away from Paris. Somehow his mother knows that Louis Pasteur is working on injections, takes the child all the way to Paris, which that's a long trip pre-car, pre-bus, right? I mean, how does she even get there with the boy? Begs Louis Pasteur, please save my son with your new brilliant science.
How'd you
So
even hear
he,
about it?
well, I think I had to dig so deep into this. What happened was Pasteur was talking about his experiments, publishing about them, and the local doctor in this town heard about him.
Oh,
So the mother, the whole thing's really fishy, but we do know this poor boy ended up in Paris, and they took the dried up brain and spinal cord of a dog that had rabies and injected it into this kid something like 12 times over a course of several days. They ran out of places to inject it in the abdomen. They started injecting him in his thigh and his buttocks and everything. And after about 12 or 14, the book has the exact number, I don't remember, the boy didn't die.
oh boy.
And that, Helen, is literally day one of vaccine science.
That is amazing.
And based on that insanity, Pasteur is considered one of the founding fathers of immunology. And then his son-in-law, smart guy, made that into a huge deal. Somehow that, and well, we don't say somehow, we know how, using all his journalistic, public relations, political chops, got that crazy story circulated all over the world. And suddenly, Pasteur was not just the wine and cheese and beer guy. He was the guy that was going to save the world from the scourge of rabies. So they started setting up rabies clinics. So anybody bit by a dog in Paris would go to this place. I mean, if they were
Wealthy.
susceptible, yeah, or wealthy too. And interestingly enough, it's the wealthy that it's either the very wealthy who get hit, and then on the other end of the spectrum, it's people that are
The poorest,
prisoners
yeah.
or they're soldiers and they can't say no. The average person stays far away from this stuff unless it's forced upon them.
So the poorest and the richest are the most likely to succumb to the predations of medical science's boundless thirst for
N-
experimentation.
Now we all are, but
That's
in,
true,
in
yeah.
in the old days, yeah, you were in big trouble if you were rich, and you were big trouble if you were in a charity hospital.
What was the most like mind-boggling or difficult to believe or just astonishing thing you found out in the course of researching this book?
Well, I'm right. The pastor story is a big one. That act of insanity, criminality, by the way. I mean, he wasn't a doctor. Like he shouldn't have been doing medical experiments. That is literally considered by the mainstream the birth of vaccinology or vaccinology,
Vaccine
however you pronounce it.
science, yeah.
Vaccine science. That is literally the birth. They hearken back to that. That's one of their grand milestones. And
That
it's
says a
like,
lot about the people who pursue this as science.
yeah, well, the way medical education is handled is so brutal, and it excludes so many people who would be fine physicians. I mean, you pretty much if you want to be a doctor, when you're in grammar school, you better last couple of years of grammar school, you better start getting it together. High school, you really better get it together. So that when you go, so you can get into a good college, and then when you get into that college, you better have taken already organic chemistry courses in the summer so that you can do well in the hyper competitive collegiate environment, so that you
You
have a
better be
chance to
rich too.
and oh yeah, let's not leave out Rich, right? And there's only about 20 colleges, by the way, that provide most of the doctors. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all these things, Dartmouth. If you've gone to University of Southern Iowa, it's going to be hard to get into medical school, no matter how good you are.
Well,
There
there's
aren't
another
that many.
thing. Sorry.
No, there aren't that many seats. And so they've made it really, really, really hard and really, really expensive and really, really distorting of a normal human life. I mean, you really shouldn't have to start at age 14 slaving away at the books
Yeah,
so
who
that
knows
you,
what they want to do when they're a teenager? I mean, that's kind of ridiculous.
yeah, yeah. And there's so many other ways. And by the way, Europe doesn't do this. You get out of high school, you have your good grades, you go straight into medical school.
Hmm, interesting. I
So it
wonder if
doesn't,
that's
it
why they
does
have
not.
such higher survival rates of medical procedures than we do.
Yeah, I mean they have much better systems than we do, but all this goes back to this John. Believe it or not, Johns Hopkins. You know how we're always they were the ones sitting at the table during what was that? What was that thing they did pre-COVID where they all
Oh
got
yeah,
together?
the Event 21.
Yeah, Event 21. Johns
201
Hop.
rather, 201.
Yeah, yeah. Johns Hopkins is always at the table for all this madness.
Yeah, they were there for the anthrax thing
They,
too.
exactly.
That they were dead center on that. Well, one thing I found interesting in this book is you talk about the demise of eclectic medicine, which was
Hmm.
the opposite of the what you call, I like this term, the SWAT team approach favored by mainstream doctors. Heroic and expensive assaults like bloodletting, purging, poisoning, and sedating. And even Wikipedia has a hard time finding nasty things to say about eclecticism, but it just vanished with no trace. Basically, there was the Wikipedia article has a quote from some guy who was digging through the archives of what was the last remaining eclectic medicine school in the United States and how it's all been coalesced into this tiny little nucleus of information. Where did all this knowledge go, and how was vaccine science able to do away with it so like completely?
Oh, wow. Okay. First, yeah, let's unpack this because there's so many important things. Standard medicine from the 1700s to, mid late 1800s was what they called heroic medicine, and it had the following features. First, they would bleed you because you're hot. If you're sick, your heart was your blood was probably hot. So that was their theory. So they would bleed you. How much would they bleed you? Well, the night that George Washington died, they took a quart of blood out of him. I don't know how many people could survive losing a quart of
Yikes.
blood, but that was a therapeutic method used for decades. And by the way, you had to be rich to get that. If you were living out in the country or in the woods, or you're a farmer, a yeoman farmer, or whatever, you're not getting that kind of fancy treatment. That was for urban people with a lot of money. The next thing they do after they bled you is they would purge you. And they would purge you by giving you foul substances, some of which included mercury and arsenic, so that you would vomit your guts out, so that you would completely loosen your bowels. And they thought, well, first we'll get all the heat out of their body, then we'll get all the bad stuff out of their body with these purges, and then we'll fortify them with opium and alcohol.
That always helps.
And this will kind of like it was like resetting your computer, rebooting that was sort of their idea. That was medicine for that was when the AMA was founded, and they're one of the devils in this story. When the AMA was founded, that was medicine. And by the way, when the AMA was founded in Philadelphia in 1844, I believe it was, one of their original like things they wrote down as a rule for being a member. You're not allowed to talk to doctors that are not members of the AMA. You're not allowed to compare case notes. You're not allowed to share medical information, or you will be thrown out of the American Medical Association.
So it's like
And
a cult.
I mean, sounds like it to me. And what were they doing that was so great? They were bleeding people and feeding them arsenic and mercury.
Wow.
That's what their medical thing. Now, people that weren't so fortunate who were living on the frontier, and remember, we were a 90% rural uh, population in the 1800s. I mean, people were in small villages, small farms. There may be no doctor, you know. So people had to get smart. And one of the ways they got smart was they got educated by the eclectic medical school. And eclectic medicine, I wish I had all the facts of its foundation at my fingertips, but it was the innovation of one person. But what he was doing was he said, look, we've got all this amazing Native American lore. A lot of it's still living. We've got all these people that have come over from the English and the Irish brought a lot of great herbal medicine. The African Americans brought a lot of medicine, a lot of medical knowledge, a ton. Why don't we use it? Here's a crazy idea. So it was not unusual for families to learn herbalism in some depth. So, and you know what? They had no choice. They're not going to CVS or the local
True.
drug chain, right? You get sick, you're on your own. And luckily, thank God, herbs actually, when you know what you're doing, are actually quite useful, quite helpful. So where did all that knowledge go? A lot of it's sort of floating around freeform in the hearts and minds of specific individuals. There are people with YouTube channels. If you find the good ones, you'll be amazed at the knowledge and experience these people have. Um, and that was medicine in America. There was also osteopathy. There was also homeopathy. There's probably some other branches of medicine too. But it didn't just disappear, and that's we have a section in the book called Scorched Earth, and that's multiple chapters where I go into how this form of medicine was eradicated. And oh, and also the thing to know is America had more doctors per capita than any country in Europe by far because it was relatively simple. If you were a person of good character and you could stand up straight and didn't do mean things, you could go to a local eclectic medical school. There were dozens of them in the United States. I think it was like 2 years of book learning while you're simultaneously apprenticing to an active, practitioner, right? Now, to get approved, ultimately you'd have to get the guy you worked for would have to sign off and say, yeah, she's worked for me for 5 years. She's awesome. I would totally let her go off on her own and do her own thing. So it was a mix of book learning related to health, and we should hopefully we'll get to the what medical education is now. Book
Mhm.
learning related to health plus practical day in and day out. It was very common to be working during the day and going to class at night or going to class on the weekends. And these schools were all over America. They were inexpensive. All you needed was a high school diploma. You may not even need a high school diploma. Things were so much looser then. I mean, it's amazing how many presidents who were attorneys never went to law school, starting with Abraham Lincoln. We had a whole different view of education in those days. Um, so these guys would set up so there were people that were knowledgeable everywhere, but also families took it on themselves to learn this stuff too as much as they could.
But there was a lot more tendency towards self-reliance then, instead of like wanting to be rescued by medical science, because either yet, like you said, they didn't have a doctor in the village or whatever, they didn't have the opportunity to be rescued. I think that we've lost a lot in terms of migrating away from being a frontier society in that respect.
Absolutely, we can't. And I think we were talking earlier about, well, how did this whole thing go off the rails? It went off the rails when all medical and health knowledge, and it's not that bad now. But when I was growing up, I'm born in '59, right? But people that grew up in the '50s, the '60s, the '70s, even, '40s and all that, like doctors were like another world. Like they knew and we didn't know. Period. Now those walls are breaking down a little bit, but I think the thing that most has to happen, and just to sort of jump to the end of this story, the thing that most has to happen is people need to continue their interest in health. And of course, what does the medical establishment do? Don't go to the internet to try to learn
Yeah.
anything,
Don't do
right?
your own research. There was literally a Forbes article called that said "Don't do your own research." That was the title of it, and I think they took it down, but it was saved. It's archive.org, so you find
Yeah.
that one. I mean,
So these
it's
schools are everywhere.
unbelievable.
Oh, by the way, they did wild and crazy things like they admitted women.
Ooh,
They admitted Black Americans. Can you imagine?
shocking.
Right? There were even black medical schools. Now, the country was a lot more segregated back then, so it kind of made sense, for that
Yeah.
to exist. So one of the things that Rockefeller and did, and again, this is obviously a really sharp operator if you're talking about industrial cartel building, really good at that. He fell under I don't say he fell into the clutches, but some guy who had been a preacher and then discovered that he was actually better as a fundraiser, decided somehow that it was a good idea for Rockefeller to get involved in medicine. Um, and he sold Rockefeller on the idea. And they decided that one of the things they needed to do was reform medical education. And so they picked one school that they really liked, which was Johns Hopkins, which maybe we'll talk about if we get enough time. And they made that the model school. So you either had to behave like Johns Hopkins, or A, you were not going to get any support from the Rockefeller Medical Institute. It wasn't going to happen. But that wasn't all that Rockefeller and friends did. They created a really well-oiled, well-organized, super sharp legislative campaign,
Hmm.
and state by state. And what they did was previously doctors regulated themselves, just sort of like I think the bar still is that way. I think the bar gives you a legal license. I don't think the state bar gives you your license. I don't think New York
I think so,
State.
yeah.
I think that's how it works. Well, that's how it worked for medicine. So, your local medical association would, look at all the young people that were training and say, okay, you're ready. Yeah, you're not quite ready. You're never going to be ready. Get another job, and they would issue basically the license to practice. And so the Rockefeller cartel educated the state legislators, said, oh, you don't want that. You want to take control. You want to be the ones giving licenses, even though they didn't know anything about medicine because they were, lawyers and, bookkeepers, right? Um, so it gradually morphed to the point where the states would create a medical board, which was actually controlled by the local AMA chapter and pharma, because pharma was involved back then. And they became the ones that decided who could and could become a doctor. And what they did was they said, hey, you know what? You got to go to the right medical school now. Doesn't matter because what was happening is people would go to these low level. They would call all these other schools low level, but the graduates would come. They would take the entrance exam. They'd ace it, and sort of like, oh no, this isn't any good. These guys are too well educated. Okay, if you don't go to a state licensed school, now you can't even sit for the medical exam, and you
Oh,
can never get a license. Oh, and by the way, if you practice without a license, we're going to throw you in jail. That's all an early 20th century invention that never existed in the history of medicine.
so
That was
that's
a
how they took all their competition out of practice then, basically.
Yeah. So now let's say you have a wonderful eclectic medical school. It's in Cincinnati. That was where one of the best ones was. And anybody that was, a good person and wanted to work hard and loved medicine and wanted to help people, what a concept, could go there and learn. Well, all of a sudden you could go to that school, but you wouldn't be able to practice medicine with
Yikes.
your education. You had to go to one. Now, what did the approved schools? Oh, they wanted you to show up with you've had courses in modern language, you've had courses in chemistry, you've had courses in physics. I have nothing against those subjects, but administering healthcare doesn't require you to speak French
Or understand physics.
or understand physics, and you don't really need to know organic chemistry. However, and this is where we get to the crazed story of Johns Hopkins. So a typical theme is the people that make these decisions are not doctors, never were doctors, never went to medical school. But you also have like their allies who are people that went to medical school but never practiced medicine, right? Um, Flexner, there's the Flexner report, but then there was the guy, the brother of Abraham
Yeah.
Flexner did the Flexner report. He was like a self-styled education reformer. He decided that colleges had to be better, and somehow well, his brother was in bed with the Rockefellers because he was head of the Rockefeller Medical Institute, and so they put young Abraham. Simon was the guy running the Rockefeller Institute, and Abraham was the guy that ran the Flexner report. So he went around and studied all the medical schools in the country and decided they were all crap except for Harvard, Yale, Johns Hopkins, and the ones that were really hard to get into. So you had this guy named Welsh, and I think his name's William Welsh, and he got his medical degree. He went to Columbia. He got a medical degree, and he didn't really want to practice medicine. He didn't really like people that much. He wasn't really interested in sick people, but he was really interested in experimental pathology, basically cutting open live and dead and live animals and seeing what's inside. He thought that was the coolest thing on earth. So he went off, rich kid, very rich family. They sent him to Prussia. And many people have heard that the Prussians had some kind of weird influence on American culture. They really did. And one of the
Yeah.
ways it showed up was in medicine. So in Prussia, so here's where we get you're the only person I can share this story because your audience will get this. Long ago, there was a group called the Teutonic Knights, and they went to the Middle East and tried to carve out their own little principality, like so many European powers do. And it didn't work for them. So they came back to Germany with their tails between their legs, right? It's like, now what do we do? Then they saw all these pagans in what's now Poland and Lithuania. And they went to the church and said, hey, listen, if we convert these people into Catholicism, when you give us the land, would you? Because the church owned everything in those days. Like they made or broke you. Just
Right.
you can't imagine, it's how extreme it was. So the church said, we love this idea. So the Teutonic Knights went and they took over and murdered everybody and took their land and basically built a garrison state because nobody liked them. Nobody wanted them there. Nobody asked them to come. They were perfectly happy being what they were, right? And so this was a multi-century garrison state where they were always paranoid militarily. And of course, because they were afraid militarily, they needed to go out and beat people up. They needed to steal more land.
Right.
You see the pattern here? Does it
Yes.
remind you of anybody?
Sounds familiar,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. So they're doing really well. They're just kicking ass because that's all they did. They were a completely militarized state. Like the whole state was organized around military aggression and military defense. And then they got their asses kicked by Napoleon
Hmm.
in the early 1800s, and they said, "Oh my God, what did we do wrong?" And they looked, "Oh, we didn't do enough science," because the French were a little more scientific. So they went wild into science. Now, and a lot of it was good, a lot of chemistry, a lot of physics, a lot of good stuff. But on medicine, they went really weird. And they decided that rather than worry about clinical medicine and all that stuff, what we really needed to do is cut things into pieces and look at them through microscopes, which had just been perfected. They'd been around for a couple of centuries, but they were really perfected and mass produced in Prussia. And so medicine for Prussia became, hey, wake up, do a few cadavers, go up, deliver a baby without washing your hands because who cares? It's the charity hospital, right? And all these hospitals all the modern hospitals in Prussia were built around these horrific, but not horrific. I mean, if you're into experimental pathology, well, experimental pathology basically means injuring and sickening animals and then cutting them up and seeing what you did to them.
Lovely.
Okay. So, yeah, that's experimental pathology. And so Welsh came over. This is the rich kid who never practiced medicine, but did have a medical degree. He came over and said, "I love this stuff." And he spent 7 years in Prussia working in these sickening laboratories. And by the way, they were run on a military basis. Herr Doctor was the king. Lots of verbal humiliation, lots of abuse of the students. Just military. Prussia, the Prussians.
Yeah.
They're not cool. So he comes back to the United States all aflame with this is the future of medicine. And unfortunately, he landed at Bellevue Hospital, which was then it was a hospital and a teaching place, no more, but it was. And they said, "Well, listen, you can set up your little experimental pathology lab. We're not going to fund it," but he had a rich family, and they were doctors and people, and they funded it. And then this guy named Johns Hopkins died. He left a ton of money to build a medical school. He's dead. Then the trustees, they decided, hey, we like what this guy Welsh is doing. He's cutting things up. He's looking at things through microscopes. It's the future. It's modern life. Let's be modern, just like the Prussians. So they funded him, and they made him the original dean of the medical school. They built his experimental pathology lab even before they built Johns Hopkins Hospital. His lab was running 7 years before the medical school was even built. So when the medical school was built, instead of, hey, here's how people get sick, and here's an herb that helps, and here's how you can da 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 da, the first 2 years, microscopes, cutting animals up, live animals, vivisection, learning crazy, complicated chemistry that nobody needs. You don't need it to heal anybody. So the first 2 years, the education was how to be an experimental pathologist in the Prussian style. That's Johns Hopkins.
Basically alienating you from the possibility of ever identifying with your patients.
Pretty much, pretty much. And then the second 2 years, you'd go on rounds, but basically you'd spend, 2 weeks looking at what the obstetricians did, and then 2 weeks looking at what the surgeons did, and 2 weeks you learned nothing, and you were required to have what? A long residency. Because you didn't know anything. You literally, even today, it's a little better now, but not much. You literally graduate from medical school. I learned this when I wrote What the Nurses Saw. And I was talking to the nurses about all the residents that were running the COVID wards.
Yeah.
She said, they told me, listen, you got to understand, these people know nothing. They've graduated from school. They know organic chemistry. They know how to look through a microscope. They don't know anything about therapeutics or clinical work at all. That's what they learned during their 4, 5, 6, 7 year residency. So Johns Hopkins created that form of medical education where the first 2 years are just, raw science that has nothing to do with clinical practice. The next 2 years are sort of dallying around. Then you graduate. Now you're finally able to be a resident where you work like a slave, 80, 100 hours a week, low pay, lots of abuse. You know, that was all imported from Prussia. And the guy, now it gets even better. This is in the book, in the long book, which isn't out yet, so everyone will get a preview now. The guy that ran the first residency program in America was a cocaine addict.
Oh boy.
He cured himself with morphine and then
I
became a
think I read
40.
about this guy.
Yeah,
Yeah, what's
I
his
forget Kelly. I think it was his name or something like
there
that.
were a couple of them that were massive coke fiends. Yeah. I mean, that was like
Well,
kind of the
yeah,
in
because
thing
like
for doctors that those days.
yeah, well, this thing was invented, and it's like, hey, it kind of gives you it's good for adult, for an anesthesia, and wow, it's kind of gives you a lot of energy.
Got to work 100 hours a week. It certainly
Well, I mean,
helps.
yeah, so the guy that invented the completely unhinged, insane residency program that basically the whole system has the function of driving out anybody who is sane. I hate to say it, because who would want to spend, 4 years in high school slaving away so that you can get into a good college and already know organic chemistry so you can get a good mark on the 4 years of that. Now you're in medical school where you're learning absolutely nothing about clinical work, and then you go into a residency where who can do that? So you get people that are very achievement oriented and they're very
I would think they would also be kind of insecure because they realize by the time they get to their residency that they don't really know what they're doing, but they've spent so much money and time putting into their education that they kind of like have this sort of hook in their soul. They don't really know, like they feel very insecure, but they have to project the image of authority.
they're trained, by the way, to project that image of authority. That's part of the game because that's they're modeling it on the people that are around them.
Right, and I mean, I learned in high school anatomy class that the entire reason for all these Latin and Greek terms for all of the medical things is to hide what you're doing from the patients.
I mean, it's incredible. When you break down any of these really complicated Latin or Greek medical terms, they're all like the simplest term in the world.
Yeah,
Like
and
in Latin,
it's entirely
like
to
the
create
big arm bone,
a secret
It's like,
language for obfuscational purposes.
yeah, so that kind of crazed on because we've had medicine for thousands of years, and the Prussians took it in a really weird direction, and then this guy Welsh brought it back, embedded it in Johns Hopkins, and then Rockefeller said, "This is it. This is what we're going with. If you're not doing this, you're dead."
So he latched onto Johns Hopkins, even preferable over Harvard and Yale, or
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah.
wow.
Yeah. Because because when Abraham Flexner, the guy that never went to medical school, the guy that never treated a patient, the guy whose only qualification was he taught Latin and Greek, he just decided that guys looking through microscopes was the future, and that's what they were doing over in Prussia, and we got to do that here. And then Welsh came back and installed this, and they looked at Johns Hopkins and said, "This is it. This is modern. All these other schools suck. Harvard, you want to be a medical school? You got to build a big laboratory. Yale, same thing. And you other schools, we don't care what you do. We're not supporting you. However, we are working with the legislatures to get you erased from history." Which is exactly what they did. I mean,
They did a pretty good job, yeah.
I mean, imagine, I mean, there weren't 50 states in the Union then because Alaska, Hawaii, and all that, but there were a lot of states. Imagine the work involved in wiring every single state legislator to completely throw out a medical system that was working pretty good. Could it have been better? Sure. Should we have science and medicine? Of course,
Yeah,
but
and the
yeah.
ultimate litmus test would be though, like with these legislators and the Rockefellers and all the people who worked for them, when they got sick, who did they go to?
Well, that's the other. So there you have the rich people again.
So they believed fully in their science.
they're the greatest victims of all this. I mean, I find the more wealthy somebody is, the more likely they are to think that modern medicine knows it all. Um,
Also, the
yeah,
more educated somebody is,
yeah,
because again, it's the sunk cost fallacy. I've spent all my life learning this, and therefore
yeah,
it must
yeah.
be true,
No, it's
or else
true.
I've wasted my life.
It's true. So basically, modern medicine is an artifact of these, kind of bloodthirsty, greedy, Teutonic knights who built a culture based on land theft, and that morphed into Prussian culture, a militarized culture, and then the Prussians, looked at medicine through their crazy lens, came up with this form of medicine that puts experimental pathology at the foundation of everything, and then that got imported over to the United States, embedded in Johns Hopkins. Uh, Abraham Flexner and Rockefeller and the guys around Rockefeller looked at that and said, "Looks modern to us. You win. Everybody else dies."
Wow.
And that's why we have the medicine we have today. That's the
That's
only reason. It's completely arbitrary.
wow. Yeah, I mean that in and of itself should be enough reason for people to buy your book. I think that the people don't realize how thin of an underpinning that this huge multi-trillion dollar industry has today. I mean, do you think there's any possibility of redeeming vaccine science, given that there's no science underlying it? I mean, people had some hope for RFK Jr. back in the day, but that back in the day, 2 years ago, whatever. But doesn't
I'm
seem to be.
waiting. I'm waiting to
Yeah.
find. I mean, I'm really looking hard to find something that's like, oh yeah, this is really good science. I get it. I get it now. This is why they're doing this. And here we are, 2025, and they're still saying just get the vaccines.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they've stopped giving them to 6 month olds, but that's like,
Oh,
okay, that's a tiny tiptoe on the step that there's like a million miles to go here, and I'm not seeing that happening. So, yeah, is there any future in vaccine science, or would we just be best throwing the whole thing away and starting over with eclecticism and homeopathy
well,
and naturopathy and all this?
I think if somebody can find some real science somewhere, because I also have a chapter on polio. That whole thing, complete nuts, completely nuts. I don't know how much time. Do you have any more? Do you have time? I'll give you.
We have a little time,
Okay,
yeah.
okay. The first outbreak of polio, because infantile paralysis, it's a real thing. If a kid gets really, really sick, they may also be paralyzed. Why? Because their nervous systems aren't very well developed, and if they have a bad brain inflammation, it's going to immediately appear in their motor movement because their motor development isn't that great. They're very vulnerable. So infantile paralysis, it happens. Epidemics of infantile paralysis never reported in the entire history of medicine until in the slums of New York City and Brooklyn, where people were living, 10, families of 10, no light, no fresh air, right? And so the city fathers, using the public health measures encouraged by Johns Hopkins, went through and with carbolic acid, which is a toxic substance, and they would mop the floors of the tenements and paint the walls with it, spray the beds with it, right? Who's going to get the worst of that? Is it the
People
adults that are
sleeping in the
walking around?
beds. Yeah, the
It's
kids.
going to be little kids crawling on the ground who are very tiny and have very undeveloped livers. So there was an outbreak of something, they called it polio, but what it probably was these ridiculous, crazed public health measures where they were literally spraying toxins into the residences of the people living in Brooklyn and this people in slums. They didn't do this on Fifth Avenue.
Then wasn't it later DDT was also found to be
Well,
something somehow
yeah, well
responsible?
that's another part of it. So one of the treatments for polio in those days was to inject right into the spinal cord a drug that turned into formaldehyde. And the idea, this was Johns Hopkins, this was New York City medical,
Wow.
public health. The idea was that it would, what do you call it? When you have an infection, it would, well, eradicate. It would eradicate the infection. It would sterilize. The
Sure.
idea was they figured, well, something's happened to the kid's spine because he's not moving, so there must be a disease in it. So let's sterilize it. So let's inject phenol because they were injecting the same thing they were spraying on the floor into kids' spines,
Oh my
and they were
God.
wondering why they became
Oh, they're
permanently
dying. Yeah.
paralyzed. Okay, so then they did a backwards thing, and they said, well, this thing, where did it come from? And then they went back to a history that sometime in the late 1800s, and in Massachusetts and I think it was Vermont or New Hampshire, because it was Eastern Mass, there was this weird outbreak of infantile paralysis. And they went back and said, oh, that must have been this polio thing that we just discovered, right? What they didn't, now, as soon as I saw that, I said, because I live where they grow a lot of apples, and they've been growing apples for a long time. And there are plots here that cannot be built on because there's so much arsenic in the soil. Because they used to spray arsenic on apples.
Oh,
Now, why did they do that? They changed the name of this thing, but it used to be called the gypsy moth. Um, well, when that moth first appeared in North America, and it appeared right where this big outbreak of polio took, so-called polio took place, it went wild, like in a way we can't imagine. I mean, every tree covered, from root to stem, the sides of barns covered, houses covered. It was insane. So what they did was they created a substance made of arsenic and they sprayed it everywhere in people's houses, on the walls, in the orchards, and a whole bunch of kids, always young kids, by the way, not adults. A whole bunch of young kids became paralyzed all at once. And nobody knew what happened. But 30 years later, they said, aha, that must have been the first outbreak of polio.
I mean,
No, it
was it
was
not the common sense, like if you spray something to kill a living thing, this moth, might it also kill other living things like humans?
there was no common sense. So then now we've got they go, okay, well, we can't be spraying arsenic on people. So let's stop doing that. Hey, here's this great stuff, DDT. We love this. And they used a lot of DDT in World War II, a ton. And they built, and most importantly, they built factories and staff and the whole thing, all geared up to make DDT during the war. And after the war, they put DDT in everything. And people were spraying DDT in their houses and in their yards, and trucks were going down the street
Yeah,
spraying
kids were
DDT.
being told to chase the DDT truck to make sure they get sprayed.
Yeah, and so they're safe from the whatever it was supposed to get them. And of course, DDT turns, it's interesting, Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, and everybody was very hyper aware that this DDT was killing birds. But they didn't make as big a deal of the fact it was causing paralysis in children. So you can see the chart. As soon as they stopped using DDT, the
Yeah.
polio rate
Which of
fell
course
off.
the vaccine industry took credit for once again, as that seems to be their top skill. What they lack in scientific skill, they make up for in PR. Now we're kind of running out of time here, so
Okay,
is there anything else you want to tell people about?
here's what the book looks like. Can you see it? Yeah, you can see it. Um, yeah, I don't. It may be a cabal, like beyond our perception. But I think the actual story really is what happens when some rich dude with tremendous political and public relations, and you put your finger on it, the public relations is everywhere. The guy that ran the polio thing was the supervisor of Edward Bernays on the Creel Committee.
Wow,
Okay, Ed Bernays was just like a low-level dude. Okay, and this guy was one of the main Creel Committee men. I can't remember his name. It's a French name. He's an American guy though, and he was the guy that was behind the whole polio is going to get us all. By the way, speaking of polio, FDR probably did not have polio.
really? What was wrong with
He
him?
probably had something else. He went swimming, in some really cold water near a sawmill area, right? And
Oh,
yeah, it's possible he was exhausted. Took in a lot of whatever the industrial output of that sawmill was, and because the paralysis came on way too fast for it to be anything other than poison. But for some reason, they called it polio. And then polio, because of FDR, became the cause célèbre in
yeah.
America. And
Maybe that's why
maybe,
they called it polio. They wanted someone to piggyback on.
there you go. And I mean, and literally, what this guy invented, he invented the March of Dimes. But the other thing this PR guy invented was every time it was FDR's birthday, communities all over America would put on little balls. Now we lived in a much different society back then. Like communities were a lot tighter. Everything was a small town. So when somebody put on a community ball, it was a big deal. Everybody went. So there were thousands of these promoting find the cure for polio. And this went on for decades, so that by the time Salk came up with whatever, creation he came up with, the public had been primed for decades, waiting for the cure of this thing that was already disappearing and was never a big deal until we started poisoning children.
Yep, and this is one of these things that repeats itself again and again. I mean, you wrote a whole book about Fauci's first fraud with the
Right,
AIDS thing.
right.
Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into that right
Yeah,
now,
yeah,
but I
yeah.
mean, it's just history repeats itself again and again is the lesson you can take from this book.
And it's been going on a long time. Like Fauci, that COVID thing was not their first
No,
rodeo. AIDS wasn't their first rodeo.
no.
Polio wasn't their first rodeo. they've been at it a
It's
long
really,
time.
it's about time that people smarten up and stop letting them do this to us because, I mean, it is like you will find yourself laughing. When I was reading some of these excerpts, it's like I couldn't help it. It's just so absurd. You laugh and then you realize this actually happened to people, and it's so absurd though that we've allowed ourselves to be sort of shanghaied by this these rich people with too much time on their hands and like unvented killer fantasies or whatever. I mean, whatever makes you want to cut up live animals. I don't think that that's a very wholesome impulse, but what do I know? I don't go to
Yeah.
medical school.
Yeah, you know, we have Bill Gates, and I've got a chapter I'm working on it. I think I can flesh it out enough so that it's a full chapter. There was a very conscious, deliberate passing of the torch from the Rockefeller group to Bill Gates.
Mm,
There was a lot of cross-pollination of people that worked for both institutions. So,
interesting.
yeah,
We
it's
got 2 minutes, so I wanted to hear about that, but we only got 2 minutes, so unfortunately Zoom doesn't let us talk and talk and talk. But read the book. I will read the book when the full thing comes out, and it's been
but get
great talking to you, Ken.
the short book is good too. You don't have to wait till the whole book because who knows when I'll be ready with that. I mean, that's going to be a monster. And I've got 50 chapters done, but you know.
Yeah, there's always more to dig. Turtles all the way down. Is it not?
Yep. And I
All
have to
right.
say, I want to tell your listeners because it's true. Helen's a huge inspiration to me. So when I'm writing this
Great.
book, I'm thinking about the stuff Helen writes. I'm like, it's got to be at least as good as Helen's stuff because you dig deep. You dig very
Well,
deep.
I go
This-
where the
you've been-
story is, and unfortunately, that sometimes takes some time, but it's worth it because the people just need to know what's going on here.
and the truth is more bizarre than your
Yes,
wildest imagination.
yes, that is true. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Thank you, Ken, for coming on, and yeah, everybody read the book and learn about what's being done to you in the name of science.